was just a smart aleck.
Life doesn't mean anything to him.
We had a wild killer on our hands. Everybody in town thought that they were next.
Oh, I think anybody that wasn't afraid of Charlie Starkweather was crazy.
There was really no way that I could really stop it. He was a madman.
My kids are suffering from it, and I wish they would just let the name drop and let the man sleep in his grave.
On the jailhouse wall in Gering, Nebraska, the sheriff finds the scratchings of a prisoner held overnight. By the time anyone will read this, I will be dead for all the killings. From Lincoln, Nebraska, they got us January 29, 1958. Kill 11 persons. At the bottom, a rough heart surrounds the names Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate. The shorthand of a crime spree that 30 years ago tore a hole through Nebraska's innocence and shocked the nation.
Heavenly shades of night are falling. It's twilight time. Out of the mist your voice is calling. 'Tis twilight time.
Lincoln, Nebraska, December 1st, 1957. The Crest service station is one of the busiest gas stops along the busy Cornhusker Highway. Robert Colvert works the graveyard shift, pumping gas. That night, right over there, Colvert faced off with a .410 shotgun, held by a kid wearing a red hunting cap and a bandana over his face. With the night receipts in hand, Colvert followed orders, driving the robber north of town. Once they got out of the car, the gunman made sure Colvert would never tell a soul. They found his body lying in the road the next morning. 2 months later, police would find out his murderer was Charles Raymond Starkweather.
Wake up, Little Susie, wake up.
Murder wasn't new to Lincoln, but it still is uncommon. Only 7 people met violent deaths through the 1950s. With crime so rare in the late 50s, only 3 police cars cruised the night beat. Chief of Police Joe Carroll prided himself on never having let a murder go unsolved.
Normally, it was routine work. 51 weeks out of the year, but then you get a bombshell.
I told you, Mama, that you'd be in by 10.
Boasting the state capitol and university, this spick and span town grew from the prairie. The values pretty basic, the virtues abundant. The Lincoln Journal was the state's second largest newspaper, and Neil Koppel was its editor.
It was indeed one of those places where you said, this is a good place to raise a family. I think that describes it fairly well.
Well, bless my soul, what's wrong with me?
Lincoln stood unprepared for the bedlam unfolding in a ramshackle home on the north edge of town. Address, 924 Belmont. The home belongs to a carpenter, Marion Bartlett, his wife, Velda, their baby, Betty Jean, and a daughter from an earlier marriage, Caril Ann Fugate.
My knees are weak.
At 14, Caril proves to be a problem, growing up faster than her parents find comfortable. Her steady boyfriend troubles the Bartletts. Charlie Starkweather, 19 years old, once a garbage collector, hangs around the house quite a bit. When talk of marriage and fears of pregnancy arise, the trouble begins.
I'm a little mixed up on the field.
A lot of the old Belmont neighborhood has just simply been torn down. But when Charlie Starkweather came to Caril Fugate's house, right about here on January 21st, 1957, her mother was already tired of her seeing the guy. Her father, according to Charlie, literally kicked Charlie right out the front door. A few minutes later, Mr. Bartlett's boss got a telephone call saying he wouldn't be into work that day. That call was actually made by Charlie Starkweather. He then hung up the phone, walked back up the street, and what happened next has never really been clear. A note found in Starkweather's coat pocket, written as if Caril is the author, gives this account. My dad got mad and began to hit him, meaning Charlie, and was pushing him all over the room. Then Chuck got mad and there was no stopping him. He had a gun with him. Chuck pulled it, and there's a picture of a bullet. Came out and my dad dropped to the floor. At this, my mom was so mad she had there's a picture of a knife drawn, and was going to cut him. In broken English, the note details Mrs. Bartlett's shooting and the murder of the baby Betty Jean. It indicates Caril helped kill her own family, but it's never been clear if she was even home from school. The bodies are hauled out to the chicken coop and outhouse out back. Over the next week, Charlie and Caril stay in the same home in which her family had been slaughtered. Caril turns away any visitors at the door. A handwritten note tacked to the screen reads, "Stay away, everybody is sick with the flu, Miss Bartlett." Charlie passes the time throwing his hunting knife into the wall, playing cards, watching television. One morning, he earnestly saws off the barrel of his brother's shotgun. Monday, January 27th. Caril's grandmother, Pansy Street, both furious and scared, marches up to the front door, only to be turned away by Caril like the rest. Before leaving, Miss Street vows to return with the police. Later, detectives poke around the Bartlett place, find nothing wrong, and leave. Nobody thinks to check the sheds out back. Charlie already fixed a flat tire in his '49 Ford, packed up his shotgun, and hit the road with Caril. The black Ford heads south, stopping at a filling station near Bennett, Nebraska. Caril buys hamburgers and road maps, while Charlie picks up shotgun shells and 2 boxes of .22 cartridges. Starkweather knows the area, hunting the hedgerows on farms here. It was a bad choice today. Halfway up a rutted dirt drive, his Ford sinks in the mud. Charlie and Caril take refuge in a storm cellar near a demolished schoolhouse. Too cold to stay, they walk to the end of a drive where a 70-year-old bachelor farmer named August Meyer lives. It was right around noon when Charlie and Caril made their way up the lane to the Meyer farm. They came around here to the back porch. August Meyer greeted them at the door when he heard the knock. He recognized the young man from the times he'd been hunting here and wasn't surprised to see him carrying a shotgun. They told him about the car being stuck. He agreed to help, went back inside to get his coat. When he came back outside, a single blast from Charlie Starkweather's .410 killed the old man. Charlie ransacks the place in search of guns and money. Caril remembers sitting in the kitchen eating cookies and Jell-O from Meyer's refrigerator, telling Charlie, "Let's go, I'm scared." An unknowing neighbor of Meyer's helps the 2 teenagers push their car out of the mud. Charlie and Caril just drive around Bennett, returning to the farm at dusk. In Lincoln, Caril's brother-in-law returns to the Bartlett's home with Charlie's brother, convinced something is very wrong. Walking out back, they find the bodies of Marion, Velda, and Betty Jean Bartlett. Lincoln's police chief was stuck at the courthouse all day on jury duty for a civil trial, and he didn't like it.
Judge adjourned the court proceedings there along about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I went back to the police station, and then about 4:30 we got the call from out at Belmont.
Chief Caril telephones County Attorney Elmer Scheel. "It looks like we've got a dead one," he said. At the Belmont address, police find Marion Bartlett's body in the chicken coop, wrapped in heavy paper and rags. In an outhouse, the bodies of Mrs. Bartlett and her baby daughter. The brutality of the killings is startling.
Charlie Starkweather's name came to mind right quick. We all came to the conclusion right quick that Caril Fugate was a willing participant in the crimes.
This already ranks as the worst murder in the history of Lincoln and a major story for the local paper.
Lincoln has a very peaceful past, and it would, at the start, a triple homicide would have been an enormous tragedy in Lincoln.
Koppel assigns the Journal's young police reporter, Leo Scher, to write up the Bartlett murders.
I'm 22 years old. I've never had a murder case before, and to find a murder case developing with 3 people, obviously it was, you knew you had a story to report. Before it ended up, you had more than a story. You had a massive story that was worldwide.
In Bennett, Bobby Jensen, Robert Jr., hadn't heard about all the commotion 10 miles away. Bobby closes up the family store, delivers milk to a customer, and heads home for dinner. A block away, his girlfriend, Carol King, helps out in the kitchen. After dinner, she joins Bobby for a drive. Carol's catching a cold, so they'll be home early. At the Meyer farm, Starkweather's Ford spins its wheels in a foot of mud. This time, there's no one around to help, so Charlie and Carol walk up to the road. 15 minutes later, Bobby Jensen's Ford pulls over, wondering if he can help. The most popular couple at Bennett High just picked up the most wanted criminals in Nebraska. Remembering the storm cellar, Charlie orders a teenager to turn the car towards the Meyer farm. Half an hour later, Bobby Jensen and Carol King are dead. In Lincoln, police investigators piece together the story behind the Bartlett murders. Inside, evidence Starkweather is a serious threat. A sawed-off shotgun barrel sits on the piano, a box of bullets on the dresser. A warning radioed to all police officers, armed and dangerous. A rookie officer, Dean Leitner, patrols the backyard.
My first involvement was at the Bartlett's, where he had stationed me inside the chicken house. The theory being that Charlie and Carol were going to be coming back and setting fire to the house. I know I spent the entire night in very, very cold and somewhat scared, I might add, in the chicken coop.
The night passes quietly for Officer Leitner. At the Lincoln Journal, somewhat of a coup. One of editor Koppel's reporters lifted the first photograph of Starkweather and Fugate sitting side by side in the Bartlett home.
One of my reporters out there got that picture, told me he had it, brought it in. I had it copied immediately and replaced and taken back. There's that picture, by the way. That's the one of the kids in the living room, right there. The one I talked about.
That's the one you stole.
That's the one we stole. Today, I don't know whether we would have done what we did.
By the time the morning edition hit the streets, everyone knew Starkweather and Fugate. January 28th, midnight, and the Jensen family worries. Their son and his girlfriend still aren't home. The King family hasn't heard from the kids either. They call the Nebraska State Patrol. At 3:19 in the morning, the patrol broadcasts a missing persons report on Robert Jensen Jr. and Carol King.
We were very fearful if there was a connection.
Expecting the worst?
Yeah, it was due to the fact that what they've demonstrated out there in Belmont.
Charlie and Carol drive all the way to Hastings before turning the car around and heading back for Lincoln. Descriptions of the Jensen car fill the airwaves. Driving within a few hundred yards of Carol's home once back in Lincoln, they can see police officers in the yard. No one spots them. In a neighborhood Charlie knows from his days as a garbage collector, they park in an alley and sleep, while Lincoln police look in all the wrong places. Charlie wrote later, "We was gonna have to stay someplace that day, 'cause the car we had. We drove all over, thinking what house would be the best place." They chose the home of Seelauer Ward. Their maid, Lillian Fensel, came to the back door and found a red-haired teenager standing there holding a .22 caliber rifle. He asked her if anyone else was home, and when she didn't reply, it took him a moment to realize that Ms. Fensel was deaf. He wrote her a note that just said, "Sit down and shut up." A few minutes later, Mrs. Ward came down to breakfast and found in her kitchen the young fugitive she'd read about in that morning's paper. Charlie and Carol make themselves at home, tossing over a chair the Bennett High School jacket taken from Bobby Jensen. Carol naps on the couch while Charlie listens to the radio. In Bennett, police get their first break. Starkweather's car is spotted stuck in a farm lane. Knowing the bachelor farmer Meyer lives at the end of the lane, they move cautiously.
The Starkweather car was down there at the Meyer farm, and we were of the opinion at that time that he was inside the Meyer home because his car was parked there.
Tipped by his sources, Leo Scherer and the rest of the press corps raced to the scene in time to see the police advance on the farm.
They were attacking the house, so to speak, like an old Bonnie and Clyde movie. They were surrounding the house. There were shotguns, there were loudspeakers. In fact, I remember I hid behind a tree. As comfortable as I was sure Charlie was in there, and there was no reason to believe that whoever it was, Charlie was going to come out with their hands up.
By bringing in tear gas, police hope to smoke out the fugitives. Officers move along the edges of the home.
I know that we used a bullhorn there to notify him to come on out and such like. We finally then crashed the house, and we found Mr. Meyer dead inside the house.
When the tear gas clears, the curious peer in the windows of the Meyer farm. His elderly brother stands scared and confused inside the farmhouse turned hideout.
Not only was there frustration, but if you look at even pictures of some of those scenes, that there was grimness on the face of all the law enforcement agents. And we don't know where they are, and there's no indication that they're going to give up. There's no indication they want to talk. The indications are you'll probably find more bodies.
The road leading to the Meyer farm fills with cars, more police, more reporters, townspeople from Bennett. Milling around in the silence that follows murder. The panic begins again, everyone rushing to the storm cellar where the old schoolhouse used to be. At the bottom of the stairs lie Bobby Jensen and Carol King. It's even worse than before. 6 shots to the head killed the boy. The girl has been raped and mutilated with a knife.
I think the intensity grew on it because we figured that we had a wild killer on our hands.
And nobody was outguessing Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate. The assumption from the outset was that they had left. They had to have left Lincoln. They had to have left Lancaster County, probably had left the state. That was normal behavior. You had to assume that.
Lauer Ward, chairman of the Capitol Steelworks, leaves a meeting with Lincoln's mayor, concerned with the 3 murders in Bennett. With that on his mind, panic must have been natural when once home, he spots a strange car in his garage. Starkweather greets him at the back door with a rifle. They struggle. Ward makes a run for the front door. Before he opens it, Starkweather kills him. Lauer Ward's Packard becomes the new getaway car. Charlie tries to change his hair color using black shoe polish and puts on a white dress shirt of Mr. Ward's. He apparently made up his mind to drive to Washington State. No police roadblocks slow his escape from Lincoln. Evening approaches in Bennett, Nebraska. Terror stalked the countryside, wrote the Omaha World Herald. Farm homes became armed camps, and tight-lipped men and women burned lights far past the usual bedtime.
I called in part of my story from one of the taverns I remember in Bennett. And I remember that there was just a silenceness. It's a small community, and it's just complete shock.
That evening, 30 men cradling shotguns clean out the supply of ammo at the hardware store. The shopkeep warns, "We all have guns, and we won't mind using them."
Everybody in town thought that they were next. They locked their doors. They were frightened, scared to death in their own homes. Scared to death in their own homes. People stayed up all night. Took turns sleeping if they sleep.
Now, 30 years later, I might have worried more about that than I did that. Now, I think I would have worried about trying to quote people who would assure the citizens of Lincoln that things were that things were probably all right and so on. But of course, as it worked out, that wasn't the case. So I don't know. I didn't do it anyhow.
Nobody sleeps. Ironically, there is nothing to fear this night. Wednesday, January 29th. Starkweather and Fugate passed through Grand Island, heading into the Nebraska Sandhills. In Broken Bow, a gas station attendant remembers a young kid and a girl buying gas and a road map. He asks them where they're going. "Guess it doesn't matter," the redhead replies. The FBI agrees to enter the case. The teletype wired to agents across the nation reads, "Subject Starkweather described, slight impediment of speech, very bow-legged, walks with a swagger, smokes king-size Marlboro cigarettes, drinks beer to excess." Before a Lancaster County judge, prosecutor Elmer Scheel swears a murder charge against Charles Starkweather.
I don't believe there. I know that there wasn't a gun in Lincoln that could have been bought at that time, and I'm pretty well convinced there wasn't even a bow and arrow that hadn't been sold.
Are you joking when you say
I'm
that?
not joking. I'm not joking.
Up the street at the Lincoln Journal, editors discuss the possibility the paper won't even be delivered this afternoon. The carriers' mothers won't let them outdoors. The paper plans for the unpredictable.
What's the worst thing that can happen during our next press cycle? What's the very worst thing that can happen? And the answer usually was, we'll find more bodies. And, you know, the shocking thing was we did.
The police rushed to the home of a prominent industrialist, Seelauer Ward, after an employee reported he hadn't arrived at work. Mr. Ward lies dead in the front hall. Mrs. Ward and their maid, Lillian Fensel, had been murdered upstairs while bound and gagged.
They were getting rather nervous, but it was the killing out at the Ward's house that really blew the top off, because then they knew that that Fugate and Starkweather were still in our midst.
Mayor Martin and I have made an appeal for all adjoining counties, including Omaha, to send all available help they can to Lincoln. It is our opinion that the car is still in this vicinity. We know he has been for the last 3 days, and we want to cover Lincoln block to block.
The Wards lived in a very exclusive area of Lincoln, near the country club. I guess it was one of those things you would think that you didn't have murders in those districts in those days.
It could not have been worse news. The city, already edgy, slips towards insanity. The word spreads that a citizens' posse is forming at the courthouse. Dozens of armed volunteers arrive, looking to be the one to kill Charles Starkweather.
They came down to the courthouse. A lot of them carrying shotguns and wanted to go out and as a posse and such like and look for them and such like, and they were afraid that they might shoot each other. At least the vast majority of them had good intentions and such like, but of course I think there were a few of them that could have been classified as crackpots.
Parents rush to schools, leading little children to their cars, their role models cradling shotguns. Governor Victor Anderson assembles 100 combat-trained National Guardsmen to aid in the search.
Helplessness.
You'd lost control of the city.
Yeah. Oh, my, yeah. My gosh, it was an armed camp.
This was an especially bitter lesson for a rookie cop like Dean Leitner.
To this day, I'm just absolutely astounded. And probably thankful it was only for 44 hours. Had that gone longer, I'm absolutely astounded that there wasn't other people shot and ran down in cars. I really was.
And you no longer had the law in your hands as a policeman.
Well, and there's a lot of frustration there. Sure.
12 hours of two-lane had taken their toll on Starkweather. He was exhausted. He'd already driven Lauer Ward's Packard into the ditch once, falling asleep at the wheel. He was looking forward to a rest in Douglas, Wyoming when they pulled into town at about noon. But there, a police car pulled up next to him. The officer inside waved. Charlie figured he'd been spotted. They decided they needed another car. Merle Collison picked the wrong place to park and rest from his day's work as a traveling shoe salesman. Charles Starkweather wakes him with a tap on the window. When Collison refuses to unlock the door, Starkweather opens fire. Thinking there's been an accident, a geologist named Joe Sprinkle stops to help. Now he wrestles with Starkweather over a rifle and his life. The police work for Sheriff's Deputy Bill Romer was nothing but routine that day.
Well, that particular day, the sun was shining. It was nice. It was cold. The wind was blowing.
Romer spent the morning in the neighboring county, pointing his car towards Douglas. Up ahead, a traffic jam blocks the highway.
You can see where the road drops off down there. I had just come up over the top of that little rise there behind the truck and saw these cars parked there and was unable to get through. I thought, oh boy, somebody's had an accident and their guys are fighting about it. And about that time, a young lady ran down the road towards my patrol car and jumped in with me and started crying and saying who she was and that this guy was going to kill her.
The killer flees in the Packard and careens back east towards Douglas, leaving the deputy calling frantically for assistance on his police radio. Bob Ainsley, the police chief of Douglas, Wyoming, picks up the radio alert and roars out of town, with County Sheriff Earl Heflin riding shotgun.
Oh, about 1:55, received a radio message from Casper. They said that this party was headed this direction, so I immediately come up, got the sheriff. Him and I proceeded west.
Do you have any idea who it was at that time?
Yes, they had told us who it was.
I see.
And that he was armed.
I'm in this direction, going east, come up to this traffic light.
30 years later, Bob Ainsley stands on Main Street, Douglas, remembering the day they shot it out with Charlie Starkweather.
I hooked my bumper into his back bumper to try and hold him. Well, he tore my bumper off, but we got a close enough bump on him then that Earl fired a shot, went through the back window, and shattered the back window to where that he couldn't see out of it.
The busting glass nicked Starkweather's ear. Fearing he'd been shot, he steers the Packard off the road, not quite ready to surrender.
So he went to get back into the car, and by this time, I, of course, was out of the parole car and took a shot in the door jamb in front of him. So he stepped back into the highway then.
Got within about 50 feet of us, and we ordered him to lay down on his stomach, put his hands behind his back. He just stood there and glared at us. So we dropped another shot at his feet. He then laid down, put his hands behind his back, and we handcuffed him and put him in the police car.
The chief of a two-man police force and a cowboy sheriff with a fondness for silk shirts and snakeskin boots captured the most dangerous man in America. At 3:55, the Nebraska State Patrol wires an urgent teletype message. Call off the dogs.
In the cattle town of Douglas, Wyoming, end of the trail for a smart aleck gunman. Components of his arsenal are shown here after he was taken into custody. A trail of 11 killings from Lincoln, Nebraska into Wyoming. A 3-day spree until Charles Starkweather, 19, landed behind prison bars. A News of the Day correspondent with 16mm camera made these scenes of Starkweather, which were enlarged for your theater screen.
News of the capture found many police still at the scene of the Ward murders.
I know it was a big relief, and we were sorry that the poor individual, the salesman, got killed out there in Wyoming. On that we didn't get him apprehended before that could prevent that death.
Lincoln's fear breaks like a high fever. The guns are put away.
Even though this thing only lasted a period of, what was it, 3 days, 4?
44 hours from...
44 hours from the...
That sounds like it surprises you.
Yeah, from the initial murder, yeah, it was weeks, it seemed to us. The type the heat the police department was taking.
The press descends on Douglas as quickly as Deputy Romer is able to get Caril Fugate back to the courthouse.
The next morning, you couldn't even get close to the courthouse for reporters.
On the WQUA News Phone at the present time, directly from Casper, Wyoming, is Deputy Sheriff Bill Romer. Bill, could you tell us about all of your excitement and happenings there yesterday?
This is a time when a sheriff shows off criminals for photographers like the prize from a big game hunt. The frenzy of flashbulbs and shouted questions gets no response from Starkweather. He won't act like the mad dog portrait painted in printer's ink. Before the cameras, Guy and Helen Starkweather make no attempt to defend their son. Instead, she talks how neatly he dressed and kept his hair. Guy Starkweather compliments Charles on his ability as an artist.
And sketch a person by distance studying.
That night, Charles writes a letter to his parents. The cops up here have been more than nice to me, but these damn reporters, the next one that comes in here is going to get a glass of water. He finishes, I'm not real sorry for what I did, 'cause in the first time, me and Caril had some fun.
Here's a guy, you know, that life doesn't mean anything to him. And just knowing, after Caril had told me all of these other stories about the other people that had been killed, this guy didn't care anything about anyone except he and Caril. They were the only two people in his whole world. And he wanted notoriety, and this is the way he got it.
That night, an Air Force plane airlifts the team from the Lincoln Police Department into Douglas. They discover Starkweather is a very talkative killer. On sheriff's stationery, he scrawls his first confession, admitting to murdering his 11th victim, Robert Colvert, the service station attendant, a case lost in the frenzy of the killing spree. Caril Ann Fugate fits no neat category in American criminal history. In the 2 days it took to get her back to Lincoln, Nebraska, the very lawman who jailed her divided opinions on her innocence. Deputy Romer claims the girl confessed her guilt.
As you talk more and more to her, you could see that the killings hadn't bothered her any. There didn't seem to be any remorse in her at all about the fact that her mother and stepsister were dead, or even her stepfather.
I really don't think that she was the killer herself. She was just a participant.
Sheriff Earl Heflin saw the same Caril Fugate, but today believes she was neither killer or bystander, but victim, a hostage of Charles Starkweather. It was the job of court-appointed defense attorney James MacArthur to prove that.
I think that early on, he was convinced that she was innocent and that she had nothing to do with it.
James MacArthur Jr. realized Lincoln did not share his father's faith in Caril Fugate when the phone calls started.
Tell my father that they had a necktie party for him someplace, and I mean, you know that they weren't serious, and we kind of laughed at them at the time.
The anger aimed at Jim MacArthur signals the deep wound to Lincoln's civic pride. When the Lincoln Journal runs a large front-page photo of Starkweather, readers berate the editor.
What do you mean publicizing that terrible young man? Now we had reached a point, apparently, when Lincoln was so ashamed, Lincoln was so ashamed of what had happened here, that we were ready to tone it down in a hurry.
You do the job as a reporter, but you just say to yourself all the time you're doing this, why?
Looking for answers, crowds 5 or 6 deep line the courthouse sidewalk just to get a look at the mad dog killer the papers write about. In unguarded moments, he seems no more threatening than a bored high school kid held after class. As the trial begins, sharpshooters stand atop the county courthouse. Starkweather admitted to 11 murders in a series of very conflicting confessions. County Attorney Shield takes only one to court, the murder of Bobby Jensen. In the courtroom, a portrait of Starkweather emerges. A psychiatrist testifies he is more concerned about being declared insane than he is about the electric chair. Declares another, this boy is a rather primitive person. His emotional gun is always cocked.
Anytime somebody kills 11 people, you know they're not playing with a full deck, obviously. But there was a great reluctance on the part of Charlie Starkweather, the person, the family, to even consider an insanity plea. It was against their grains at the time.
After 18 days, Starkweather foils the defense that could save his life by resisting the efforts to label him insane. Sentenced to die in the electric chair, Starkweather says nothing. Says his father, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. In the days that follow, Charlie writes the beginnings of an autobiography and begins sketching again. My rebellion against the world started that first day in school, 'cause that first day I was being made fun at, picked on, laughed at. I grew up, but the hatred I had builded up inside me and stayed with me and made me hate everybody other than my family. The sketches frequently show young women not at all uneasy about handling a gun. Caril Fugate's attorneys, Merrill Reller and James MacArthur, fought that image. A few days before Fugate's trial, they gamble.
Did you ever break down and cry and beg Charlie to let you go or anything like that?
Yes, I cried all the way.
The attorneys permit reporter Ninette Beaver to question Fugate for a solo press conference.
Now, had you gone with him for quite a while?
Yes, I'd went with him a year before, and then I told him I didn't want to see him again, but he came back. And after that Sunday, I went with him, and then I kept telling him to leave. And that Sunday, I told him to leave, and I told him I didn't ever want to see him again.
Why? What had brought you to this conclusion? Why didn't you want to go with him anymore?
I think he's crazy.
Do you think that Charles got what he deserved when he was convicted to the electric chair?
That's not my place to say.
The state charged Caril Fugate with being an accessory, a willing accomplice. MacArthur argues the girl was too frightened to flee, that she tried to alert others to her plight, and that Starkweather's confessions on every occasion contradict who did what. Starkweather testifies against his former girlfriend. I don't care if she lives or dies. The prosecutor tells the jury even 14-year-old girls must recognize they can't go on 8-day murder sprees. The jury agreed. Caril Fugate's sentence, life in prison.
He said, if they thought I was guilty, why didn't they give me the chair? She thought it was, in effect, kind of a compromise verdict.
Charles Starkweather faced death twice. As the penitentiary prepared for his execution, a federal judge stopped the process, postponing death 35 days. June 25, 1959. No legal barriers remain. Guy and Helen Starkweather make sad, fruitless attempts to save their son, then walk to the penitentiary for a final visit. That night, teenagers rally at the prison gate, rock and roll blasting from car radios. As the guards lead him to the death chamber, Starkweather asks, "What's your hurry?" Watching the preparations were observers for the state, including Leo Scher of the Lincoln Journal.
I was hopeful that maybe at the end of the story, Charlie Starkweather would say when he was given the opportunity, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. They asked him if he had any final words. He shook his head in a no way, didn't say a word, he had no remorse.
I would say this, that the execution went off as scheduled. It was a smooth operation, I guess you would say, and Starkweather went calmly to his death.
By morning, children gather at Wyuka Cemetery to watch the gravediggers. No headstone marks the plot. The state of Nebraska locks Caril Fugate in solitary confinement at the Women's Reformatory in York, the youngest female ever sentenced to life in prison. Caril remains a model prisoner, never wavering from her claim to innocence.
I'm deeply sorry it happened. And I swear to Almighty God, I never killed any of them.
And I only win because I had no choice.
15 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court rejects Caril's plea for a new trial. Her emphasis shifts to convincing the pardon board her sentence should be shortened.
We couldn't really fight the case over again.
James MacArthur Jr., after watching Caril Fugate's trial as a teenager, now helps his father as a lawyer.
Well, it was a matter of convincing the court, because of her rather unique and remarkable record in prison, that she should be released.
I feel sorry for the people who for 18 years have hated me so bad that it has destroyed their life. It's destroyed their life, and it's made their life more of a prison than mine has been.
The board votes 2-1 to commute her sentence.
I personally wish you the best of luck.
In 1976, now 32 years old, Caril Ann Fugate walks out of prison to become a hospital orderly in Michigan. Only once does she break her public silence. A TV show called Lie Detector runs a polygraph test, indicating Caril believes her family was not dead when leaving with Starkweather.
I feel personally that I have been vindicated. At that time I said, someday you're going to find out that you made a mistake. And I feel, with the help of Lie Detector, that this has been proven.
In an off-the-record meeting near her home in Michigan recently, Caril Fugate declined an interview for this program. She explained she doesn't want the killings relived again. 30 years makes the case of Charles Starkweather no less vivid in the mind. Fear, anger, and frustration create powerful memories. Joe Carroll retired from the Lincoln Police Department in 1975. His boast of no murders unsolved was not spoiled by Starkweather.
I don't think he would any more killing a human being than he would killing a squirrel.
Patrolman Leitner nearly quit law enforcement in the turmoil and in-house investigation that followed of the Lincoln Police Department.
Well, even though we were vindicated from the investigation, we were still guilty in the eyes of the community for a long time. I just about hung it up.
He didn't quit, and it is now Chief Leitner. Neil Koppel gave up the city desk at the Journal to become the dean of the journalism department at the University of Nebraska.
I'm not sure that there was any doubt in the world, in most people's minds, of Charlie's guilt. I'll admit that. And if you've read the stories, my Lord, we certainly did convict him, didn't we?
Well, you did that today, they'd probably file a lawsuit on you.
Police reporter Leo Scherer is now a motel manager and Lancaster County Commissioner.
There's no question in my mind he was a punk, and he was obviously a killer.
Over the years, James MacArthur assisted Caril Fugate with other legal matters, his view of the law largely shaped by this one case.
I still feel it was a example of where the legal system can and did break down. On the other hand, I've always been very proud of my father for bucking the obvious public sentiment and doing something that he really felt morally and ethically that he should do.
In Wyoming, Bob Ainsley traded his chief's badge for builder's tools. Deputy Bill Romer became sheriff only to lose that office, and today he sells Subarus.
If he hadn't been captured here, he'd have been captured somewhere else, but he may have killed numerous other people before that, and it's flattery.
You seem uncomfortable with it.
I guess I always have been.
The guns Romer confiscated from Starkweather sit in a storage vault at the Nebraska State Museum. The deputy's initials carved on the stock, identifying them as evidence.
He called his brother and he said, "How would you like to buy a real good Packard?" He said, "It's really a dandy." And he told him it was that Starkweather car.
The Packard Patrician, stolen from C. Lauer Ward, sits in a garage in Gothenburg, Nebraska. Alvin Wieselmeyer bought it for $200.
But here it's set up in the by the feedlot for years, Nobody paid attention to it.
It was just a plain old Packard then.
Yeah.
And then people found out it was Charlie Starkweather's car.
Yeah, then all of a sudden here, the news people in North Platte got a hold of that it was Charlie Starkweather's getaway car, They called it a getaway car,
What about that name makes people so curious?
Yeah, isn't that something?
You figured it out?
No, I really haven't. But I mean, it's always people we've had hundreds of people here, look at the car.
It is fascinating to some, irksome to others, that in the 30 years since Charles Starkweather was put to death, The folklore surrounding the killer and his crimes lives on. Why, for instance, should a total stranger concern himself with Charles Starkweather's place in history? In 1970, Jerry Petty of Baxter, Tennessee, came to Lincoln as part of a traveling singing troupe. Something of a crime buff, he came here to Wyuka Cemetery to visit Starkweather's grave and was troubled to find there was no marker designating the grave site. 3 days later, with the permission of the Starkweather family, he spent $119 of his own money to place a headstone here. Mr. Petty felt that such a historic figure, even with so dark a history, deserved that recognition. The case of 2 Nebraska teenagers spraying bullets and fear across the peaceful plains made for great storytelling. 3 books made their way to the marketplace. NBC returned to Nebraska to tell the story of Caril Fugate growing up in prison in a primetime documentary. It wasn't until 1973 that Hollywood brought the Starkweather case to theaters. The movie was Badlands.
Hi, I'm Kit. I'm not keeping you from anything important, am I?
No.
The names changed to Kit and Holly. The facts were moved around and embellished.
You promised to stay down there for an hour.
Yeah?
You expect me to believe that?
Yeah. Critics liked it. Many who knew the reality did not.
I'm gonna shut the door. Think I got him?
I don't know.
Well, I'm not going down there and look.
It's always seemed to me also that there was something about the name Starkweather, that just that name itself conjures up a certain image.
I killed everything in my bag.
A most unnerving homage came from singer Bruce Springsteen. The title track of his Nebraska album drew from Charlie's own words and the facts cultivated into myth.
At least for a little while, sir, me and her, we had us some fun. Now the joy.
Neither so haunting or poetic is the volume of leering, rather impolite prose devoted to Starkweather in pulp detective magazines over the years. 11 Dead for Teenage Lovers, Burn Baby Burn, I Saw Charles Starkweather Die. This isn't literature we're talking about here.
Well, as you know, when you sell magazine articles to magazines, you don't write the headlines.
Under his own name or an assumed identity, Leo Shear's detective story Moonlighting gave the Starkweather saga new life every few years.
It has elements in it that is a sellable piece of history. And people like to read this kind of literature at times. And this is really somewhat of a shame, is that the legend of Charlie Starkweather is built because of movies, because of magazines, because of being more than just a usual murder case, and it probably will live forever.
Sir, I guess it's just a meanness in this world.
Starkweather wrote a letter to his parents from the Wyoming jail cell. I know my sister and brothers, and even Mom, that this will take a long time before people stop looking at them in a funny way. So it would make me happy if everyone will go on like anything didn't happen. It never worked out that way.
I think it's good.
Thanksgiving, and Barbara Turner brings near her children.
That's it on that turkey.
A family forced closer by outsiders cruel enough to blame them for the sins of another generation. Barbara married and later divorced Rodney Starkweather. Had his brother Charles lived, he would have known 5 nephews, a niece, and a new 3rd generation, all still bearing the Starkweather name.
People ask me why I ever had my kids. I have people ask me why I ever thought to bring kids up with that name. It's because I loved my husband and loved my kids.
How'd that make you feel?
Angry. Very, very angry. I raised them, my kids, to understand that it wasn't their fault, and they couldn't help what happened if they stick up for themselves, and the people would say something to them, just tell them I wasn't there, and I know about it, and I just don't want to talk about it. And I had to raise them with a strong hand so they would not get in a lot of trouble.
There was trouble. It was easy to find when learning how insensitive little children can be.
That's so strange. Everybody's afraid of the name.
Kids said killer, murderer.
Who's going to be my next victim? And even the students, the teachers, and sometimes the principals were against me.
I never finished school because it got to the point where I couldn't take it no more. And so I quit because I couldn't take it.
Starkey, who you going to kill next? And, you know, they just keep pushing you and pushing you. And like I say, a lot of time we had a fight. Get sent to the principal's office. A lot.
Principal calling me at school and telling my kids got in a fight because people were picking on him. I had to call the police and have them escort my kids, my two boys, from class to class so these two bullies wouldn't pick on them.
The cruelty of children gave way to the ignorance of adults. Each has stories of losing jobs, apartments, and respect because of the Starkweather name. The fights continue, some jail time followed, and the bitterness won't go away.
I don't know, it's just tough.
Yes,
That, you know, I wouldn't change my name for anything. I mean, I'm proud of myself. I'm not saying I'm proud of what Charles did because I'm not, but I learned to live with it.
Did you ever think about changing your name?
No. I had a chance to change my name to my stepdad's name, but I decided to keep Starkweather. It's my given name. I just didn't care what people think anymore.
I didn't even tell my name, but they struggle. They hate it. They hate him. They hate it. Hate that name at all. Because what he did.
And I didn't really understand all about it when I was younger, you know, but I understand a lot more now. And it's, I don't know, it's just really, sometimes it's hard, you know. Even now, sometimes it's hard.
Why are you crying?
I don't know, it just bothers me. I just wish people would just leave it the hell alone. Because I don't want my son to go through this. I don't want him to be picked on when he's older. I don't want him to have to put up with the same things we've had to put up with.
My view about it, if a person has been did something wrong, they should be punished if it deserves to be punished. They should, if they've been in the grave, I wish people would just leave the dead sleep, because that's not doing anybody any good. No one. Brings bad memories to everybody.